time. Let's see if okay. Okay. Let's see if it okay. All right. Kabirina, a yogi's heartthrob. Kabirina, a yogi's heartthrob. This is the book called The Gurus, the Young Man, and Elder Paisios. In the ashram, there was a large building that served as a printing house devoted exclusively to printing Guru Satyananda's books. It was run by an advanced Indian Swami around 30 years old, whose siddhis, or accomplishments, whose siddhis were beginning to stir. The other inhabitants of the ashram were truly in awe of this Swami, whom they said had awakened the serpent of Kundalini. Kundalini means the coiled one. Awakened the serpent of Kundalini. The printing house where he worked was full of mandalas, signs with strange clusters of geometric patterns painted on them in vibrant colors that supposedly conveyed certain messages to the subconscious, as Jung postulated in his theory of archetypes and the collective unconscious. These striking mandalas had been drawn by an American Swami living in the ashram, under the direction of an Indian Swami who had seen them in his dreams. Under the direction of an Indian Swami who had seen them in his dreams. I worked in this printing house for several days, folding pages that were to be bound as a book. Once, while I was working, I suddenly felt an irresistible desire to draw, which I automatically obeyed by sketching some strange but impressive geometrical patterns. This drawing didn't require any special effort on my part or even the use of my imagination. It was as though I were mechanically obeying a suggestion arising from or implanted in my soul. When the person working with me insisted that I show them to the Indian Swami in charge, I let him take a look at them. He encouraged me in a friendly manner, saying, 7 leaves. 7 is a very spiritual number. For quite a few days, I continued to be in this strange state, enjoying drawing the patterns on paper or on the ground, and showing them to the Swami. Several times I even formed such patterns using mounds of earth. I had had precisely the same feeling when I first met Niranjan, the president of ashram, in his office. The president of the ashram. While I was working in the printing house, I laid eyes for the first time on an Indian woman named Kabirina, a Swami who was slightly younger than I was. We needed to talk about some issue concerning our work. As we looked into each other's eyes, we unexpectedly began to smile, excited at our pleasure in getting to know each other. There was something erotic about the sudden thrill we felt, standing there in the middle of the printing shop with everyone else seated on the floor around us. We felt so gay and happy that we almost started laughing. We made the moment last as long as we could. Then we went back to our respective tasks. Over the next few days, the Swami in charge of the printing house started acting hostile towards me. Once, when we were carrying some boxes with papers, he sharply rebuked me for being careless. I tried to make light of this remark so that we could just forget about it. I considered his comments to be unfair and, after all, didn't really consider him to be my boss. But he looked at me with a threatening glance and spoke to me even more harshly, giving the impression that he was able to hurt me if he wanted to. I was about to reply to him when the American Swami, who was carrying boxes with me, turned towards me with an alarmed look on her face and whispered, "Shh." Her fear startled me so much that I immediately obeyed her. The girl and I had become friends, so I accepted her advice when she suggested that I go and work elsewhere. When I later asked her why she had been so scared, she said that I was in great danger because he was a very powerful yogi. I was much more careful for the next few days, and I came to the conclusion that this powerful yogi was jealous because he wanted to have some sort of romantic relationship with Kabarina, or perhaps because he already had a relationship with her. Of course, there was not supposed to be any sexual activity in the ashram, and for this reason the men and women lived separately in different buildings. But what went on in secret was another matter. One day, I didn't go to work as I should have, but instead rested in my room, and I heard two women swamis outside laughing and talking quietly. One of them mentioned that a certain male swami tried to convince her to have sexual relations with him, but because she didn't care for him, she shunned him. I mentioned this to Tony, a British yoga teacher with whom I spent a good deal of time, and he didn't dismiss the possibility of something of that sort taking place. In fact, as I was scandalized to learn, he was interested in finding a way to take part in such activities. He laughed and told me that he strove to get his fill of sexual experiences so that the desire would go away. Although the yogis publicly regarded this path of having a lot of sexual relations in order to make oneself bored with them as inferior, Tony more or less supported the idea and followed it in his life. This was diametrically opposed to what I had read about in the yogis' books. But then, Tony was a yoga teacher, whereas I was a mere student. He had known yogis up close for years. while I had only known them from a distance for a short while. Years later, as I was preparing to write this book, I read one of the Guru's newer books, which completely settled this issue in my mind. The Guru publicly admitted that there is a path on the left whereby one can reach a state of ultimate awareness by means of an ecstatic experience in an orgy. But he also noted that the yogis don't broadcast the existence of this path. They keep it hidden. He wrote, because people must be mature in order to accept it. Apparently, the time was then ripe for them to speak openly about what was kept secret only a few years back. It made me wonder what other secrets were being hidden from us until we had matured. Tony, the English yoga teacher. Tony was an intelligent and physically fit Englishman of medium stature. He was the son of a minister in the Anglican Church and had studied mathematics at a university in England. At some point, he had become involved in yoga, Kriya Yoga to be precise, and had abandoned his home to become a follower of Guru Satyananda. It was from him that I learned about the Tantras and the Hindu idea of the spiritual use of sex. At first, he eked out a living by working as a yoga teacher in seminars for beginners. Afterwards, he decided to travel around the world and then spend the rest of his life in one of the Guru's ashrams. One day, when we were having a conversation about the Bhagavad Gita, he asked, "Did you know that Christ was an eminent yogi?" I responded, "So Christ was a yogi and Shiva is God?" He didn't answer. He had a preference for Shiva, the god of destruction according to Hinduism, an image of whom hung in his room, over the god of the distorted Anglican Christianity he had rejected. He used to smoke charas and had taken LSD several times, and he confessed to me that he secretly continued to smoke in the ashram, especially before the satsang, so that he would have more vibrant experiences. Indeed, I once caught him red-handed getting high with two other members of the ashram. He admired Niranjan, but he put down the Indians who weren't swamis, and still had all the airs of the ruling class of the British Empire. He gave me the Bhagavad Gita and some of the Guru's books in English, and we traveled together for a few days. My second encounter with Babaji at Allahabad. All the yogis in Satyananda's ashram were impressed by the fact that I had met Babaji and visited his ashram in the Himalayas. They would come and ask me various questions, inquiring, for example, into the ashram's precise location, a difficult question to answer. It was quite apparent that they wanted to meet this living legend, and that their estimation of me had increased because I had. Even Niranjan, the president of the ashram, admired him and was curious. Babaji, he told me, is at the highest level, expressing what seemed to be a universal opinion in the ashram. Now, I knew that the next month Babaji would be coming for a few days to Allahabad, one of the many sacred cities of the Indians in the Ganges basin. When I asked permission to go and see him, they were amazed that I intended to go to that particular city on those particular days. They considered me to be lucky because the religious feast that would be occurring in that city takes place only once every 12 years. Moreover, important yogis and impressive gurus from all over India would be gathered there for 3 days to worship the Hindu pantheon, and I would have the great honor and blessing to be present with them and to be helped by the energy and atmosphere that they would generate. Niranjan considered the fact that an uninitiated foreigner knew the place and day of this event to be an encouraging omen. So he gave me permission to travel. That is to say, he gave me back my passport and money, which, when I first arrived, the ashram had required me to surrender. So I boarded a train, and after a long journey, I arrived at the classical Indian city of Allahabad, with its multi-story wooden houses, patched together with mud, and an occasional more modern structure held together by cement. It was like a village laced with small, narrow roads, but of enormous dimensions, shrouded in darkness and overflowing with filth. Standing at the edge of this chaotic city, I realized that there were no large thoroughfares I could use to keep my bearings in its labyrinth, and no maps to chart my way. Merely entering would surely entail getting lost. I went straight to the hotel next to the station and booked a single room in order to rest, and I decided to look for Babaji on the following day. Although the probability of my finding him was very low, I believed that he would arrange everything as he had before. After my afternoon meal, throwing caution to the wind, I decided to explore the city. It grew dark as I wandered through the pedestrian-filled streets. From time to time, I would enter a back alley where I would listen to the din of life in overpopulated and poverty-stricken India. Considering the amount of human and animal waste and dirty water in the streets, I don't believe the city had a modern sewage system. I was wearing a pair of boots, which made it a bit less repugnant to walk through the cities. The Indians, however, walked barefoot. Although electric streetlights were rare, there were fires lit here and there where the Indians would warm themselves and gather for conversations that would last for hours. Many did not have anywhere else to go. So they would also sleep there, next to the sidewalk. This night, however, was different than normal. There were also present yogis who had chosen various places to loiter. One yogi might settle for a small opening between the buildings, while another might camp out in a yard or in some park. Still another might take up his lodgings under a tree. People would gather around them, sitting down and taking off their shoes in order to spend the night chanting the entire Bhagavad Gita. Some yogis would play small instruments to accompany the singing. The most pious sat near the yogis. The others would stand at a distance for a while and then leave. I walked around taking it all in. Eventually, I attached myself to an ever-increasing group surrounding a thin guru, who was dressed in an orange robe and seated in the lotus position, with a book open in front of him. His hair and beard were snow white, and his face was calm and beautiful. He sang with a melodic voice, while with his right hand he played a small instrument with a tiny keyboard. He was a model yogi, just the way I imagined a yogi should be, and I suppose it was for this reason that I was attracted to him and decided to observe him. Suddenly, I became aware that I was jerking my head back and forth, as though I were trying to rid myself of something that had sat on top of it. I rubbed my eyes vigorously in order to awake from this condition. In the meantime, the crowd became alarmed and recoiled from me in fear. And many even fled the group. I felt sure it was the work of the yogi. Nevertheless, when I came to, I looked at him indifferently and thought, "You huckster, you're nothing to write home about." To me, he seemed to be showing off. I blamed him, but I wasn't angry with him. I had lost all interest in him and his powers. Shortly thereafter, I returned to my hotel and went to sleep. When I later reflected on what had taken place, I realized that I couldn't tell when I had lost control over my senses. I didn't know when this state had begun, how long it lasted, or what I did while I was in it. I only remembered trying to get out of it. In retrospect, I saw that the hypnotic trance might have ended immediately after it began. Perhaps the yogi had attempted to control me through hypnotism, but failed. Or on the other hand, it might have gone on for an indeterminable period of time, and only at the end, when he released me, had I begun to awaken and react. In any event, the crux of the matter is that he secretly and suddenly encroached on my person without my consent, showing no respect for me, in fact, using me. It's worth noting how the people recoiled in fear. Experience obviously warned them that something evil and fearful was taking place. If they had experienced positive results from such phenomena, they wouldn't have fled. On the contrary, they would have happily drawn near. But I suppose that I had become used to such things, even if I didn't know the mechanism by which they took place, and instead of being afraid, I simply brushed him aside. Nevertheless, I was curious. Although I hadn't been able to see, hear, or touch anything, I had felt something encircling my head, touching it and letting go. At the time, I couldn't discern whether it was an energy or a spirit, but it felt like a vexing and undesirable little cloud lingering and bringing with it a hostile, foul, and utterly repulsive evil presence. Later, I would come to believe that the yogi with a beautiful face had sent an evil spirit in my direction. The next day I arose early in order to find the guru of gurus. I had an address on a piece of paper, but in the chaos that surrounded me, it was meaningless. Even for an Indian in my position, the problem would have been insurmountable. Nevertheless, I remained calm because I believed that the one who had guided me to that peak in the Himalayas would somehow intervene and draw me again to himself. Eventually, I asked someone who examined the address and told me that I had to go to the other side of the tracks, since beneath the address were printed the words "Civil Lines." When I reached the station and crossed the train tracks, I realized just what it meant to live in the Civil Lines neighborhood. I was now in another world, with large parks, expansive boulevards, and wide avenues lined with aristocratic European-style homes surrounded by large yards and gardens. Everything was impeccably clean, so unlike the city I had entered the night before, there were so few people out that the roads were nearly empty, except for a few cars, which seemed minute against the backdrop of the vast thoroughfares. Apparently, the railway line, which could be crossed only at a few elevated bridges, also served as a barrier that divided the Indian city from the area where the English colonizers had built their homes and parks. The economic inequality between these two worlds was enormous. Hunger, wretched conditions, and the struggle for survival marked life on one side of the tracks, while extravagance and luxury were the traits of life on the other side. Of course, the English colonial masters, the aristocracy of an earlier age, no longer lived in these homes. The new Indian aristocracy had taken their place. For those caught in the trap of wretchedness and poverty, there was no way out. This also included some of the Western Europeans and Americans who had come under the influence of various writers who cultivated the myth of India. Such Westerners were usually involved with drugs or became drug users in India, and as soon as their money ran out, they would sell their passport in order to buy more narcotics. Their embassies would help them in the beginning, but then when they would use that help to acquire more drugs, they would be driven away. And so these abject youth would sleep on the pavement in a dark despair that nearly drove them mad. The smooth talkers who deceived them with pleasant-sounding lies, enticing myths, and empty promises surely share the blame for their predicament. Hermann Hesse, for example, surely bears some responsibility for the droves of young people that he goaded to India with his books. If someone were to have stolen my wallet, which contained my money, passport, and return ticket, I would automatically have found myself in such tragic straits. And such a scenario was not implausible. My wallet contained the equivalent of 2 years' pay for a working Indian. Surely there were those who would risk committing a crime in order to lay their hands on it. Of course, that was a frightening scenario that I tried to avoid dwelling on. In any event, I found myself strolling through civilized Allahabad, observing its residents and catching a glimpse of their little palaces, including the home of former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Along the way, I asked about the address, but no one had ever heard of it. I sat on a bench, made an oath that I would give 10 rupees in almsgiving to a pure Indian, and asked Babaji to help me. At that point, a young man around 20 years of age passed by me riding his bicycle. I made a motion for him to stop in order to show him the address, and, like other Indians I had met, he appeared to be flattered to speak with a Westerner. He told me that he knew the owner of the house, a very wealthy book distributor and publisher with business connections abroad. The residence was about 2 miles away, and he offered to take me there on his bicycle. So I took him up on his offer, and in a short while we were in front of a mansion with a fairly large number of people milling about outside, and from the sound of it, an even larger crowd within. My companion was hesitant about entering the inner courtyard, presumably because he was of a lower caste than the house's owner, who was a Brahmin. But I was in a hurry and rushed in. The courtyard enclosed a formal garden complete with a sizable lawn, statues, and a fountain. It was a lovely day. The sun was shining and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The disciples of Babaji's inner circle, all Westerners in their 30s, were sitting on the grass by themselves. They were his permanent entourage, and no one dared draw near them. I recognized the yogi we had irritated at the Haidakan ashram when we didn't obey his order to take off our shoes and worship Babaji. Nevertheless, I walked towards them and sat next to them on the grass. I struck up a conversation with one of the more familiar and likable members of the group, a fellow who was always stark naked wherever he went and carried around a yellow fabric to spread out on the ground whenever he wanted to lay down. He told me his story. He was a Dutchman from Amsterdam who didn't at all care for life in Europe. So in his 20s, he decided to go and live in the tropical islands of Fiji. On his way to Fiji, he passed through India, where he met Babaji at the Haidakan ashram. Until that point, he had had no connection with yoga or religion. When he found himself face to face with Babaji, he told me Babaji made him feel tiny, as though he were merely 2 inches tall, and Babaji a colossal mountain. Babaji told him in a commanding voice, "You will start a business." "I will start a business?" he answered, his voice betraying shock and fear. "Yes," Babaji responded, "you will. Now go." Leaving the ashram, the Dutchman made his first business agreement. Within 3 years, this insignificant, impoverished, drug-using hippie became an international businessman who used a jet for his continual business trips, making about $1 million a year in profits. Of course, he continued, I did all these things through Babaji's power. Later, Babaji told me to stay with him, and so I abandoned everything and began to practice yoga. At this point, I directed the conversation to my own concerns and told him I don't like to work. "Then don't work," he responded. "What do you want, a quiet life?" "No, I want to learn what's going on in this world. It's all an incomprehensible mystery to me. I don't understand anything." "I've been with him 3 years, and I still don't understand anything," he replied. "I don't know who I am or where I am going. I don't know what I should do in this world. I don't know what the significance is of events or of my own actions. Do you do things you don't want to do?" "No, I'm free and do whatever I want." At this point, the others called for him, and he got up to leave. I asked where he was going, and he told me that he was going to have a smoke. I asked him if I could come along too, and he invited me. While they were preparing the chillum, I told them, "I get frightened when I'm in front of Babaji." "Don't be afraid," one of them answered. Another man smiled and said, "Don't be afraid to be afraid." He then lit the chillum and inhaled deeply, for an amazing length of time. I don't know what his lung capacity was, but when he let out his breath, the entire room filled with smoke. The others followed suit, with the same results. When my turn came, I tried to make a dignified attempt, sucking in as much as I could, but I was rather pathetic in comparison. In spite of that, it made me so dizzy that I felt as though I were about to faint. The following times, I only pretended to participate. The blend was just too strong for me. I felt unsteady as I went out into the mansion's inner courtyard. About 300 people attending various events were present, including 2 or 3 sadhus, or Indian ascetic hermits. There was a goodly number of Europeans as well, including a blonde girl in traditional Indian dress that I had met in New Delhi. The poor girl thought she was Babaji's wife and tried to behave accordingly. No one made fun of her, but they also weren't paying any attention to her. I felt sorry for her because she seemed so ridiculous. It seemed to me as though she had gone off the deep end. During all these years in India, she only rarely got to play the role that was the heart of her fantasy world. In reality, she was just another ornament in Babaji's court. Was there no one who tried to bring her to her senses and open her eyes? Indeed, from what I learned from a friend of hers in New Delhi, the Guru only encouraged her behavior. Perhaps he had had relations with her and thus led her to believe that she was his wife. All the Indians seemed to look up towards the fair-headed race that was once their country's master with awe, jealousy, and hatred. Perhaps Babaji was not an exception. I remember similar stories told by other girls who had been abused by gurus. Those with whom I had smoked had taken up their places behind Babaji, as though they were his bodyguards, and everyone else started to file past him in order to worship him and kiss his feet. His disposition would change with each person. Sometimes he would be harsh, sometimes he would be kindly, sometimes he would joke with the person. The fellow who originally gave me the address wouldn't leave me alone, insisting that I also go in front of Babaji. I was afraid and wanted to put it off. At the same time, I felt bad about putting him in a difficult situation. So I went forward. The moment I stood in front of Babaji, he grew fierce, and I was literally paralyzed by fear. With my mind, I barely managed to whisper, "Help." And immediately he softened and asked me, "Who brought you here?" "You did," I answered, ignoring all of those who were but instruments of his will. "Where have you come from?" "Munger," or Munger. He motioned for me to move along, and I gladly distanced myself from the strain and fear of being in his presence. I tried to determine what I found so terrifying, asking myself why I felt such anxiety and fear. Was it the strange look in his eyes, or his great power? Father Paisios also had great power, and his eyes at times had an otherworldliness about them, but I was never frightened around him. On the contrary, I felt quite safe. It was now time for the meal, So we sat down on the ground in rows, and each received a large leaf, about a foot long, that held potatoes, greens, and some spicy boiled rice. The man who had given me the address kindly sat next to me and told me that he had opened up a small business, which made him wealthy by Indian standards and offered prospects of even greater wealth, as he was still in the beginning stages. The guru, it seemed, distributed wealth to at least some of his followers, such as this man and the eminent book publisher who had opened up his home to us. This publisher and his family had vacated their rooms for the guru and his disciples. The expenses for such hospitality must have been enormous, since all the guests stayed in his mansion for about 4 or 5 days until Babaji went elsewhere. Everyone present had to be fed and given a place to sleep. The family's behavior in general made it clear that they recognized that their wealth came from the guru. As one of his disciples put it, naturally, everything they've built is through his power. Now it was the guru's turn to receive some benefit from the transaction. The worship of idols. After everyone had finished the meal, the sacrifice began. In the courtyard was a permanent altar where they lit the fires for sacrifices. They brought pans piled high with some sort of mixture that included plenty of ghee. Babaji offered the sacrifice with the help of his closest disciples, while the master of the house stood nearby. Babaji was chanting various hymns to the gods, and every so often he would take a large spoonful of ghee and throw it on the fire, filling the air with the smell of burning butter. Everyone followed the 2-hour ritual with piety, though the master of the house had a strange look on his face, as though he were trying to preserve his wounded pride. After the sacrifice was complete, the Dutch yogi took ashes from the blackened spoon that they had used in the ritual and placed a dot between the eyebrows of the believers. I was so impressed by the rite that I went forward for him to put a dot on my forehead as well. It never occurred to me to ask to whom the sacrifice had been offered. Once again, the influence of Christianity made it difficult for me to come to terms with the fact of real polytheism and idol worship, and having smoked the charas hadn't helped either. Afterwards, I could see the guru moving about the crowd with ease, but no one approached him or crossed his path. I lost track of him when he went towards the western side of the buildings. In the meantime, the people were forming a line. I thought they would pass in front of him as on previous occasions, and since I was ready to leave the mansion, I got in line as well. I didn't intend to worship him like they urged me to, but simply to greet him, a polite gesture in response to his hospitality. It was a long line, and I couldn't see what was happening at the front. As I drew closer, to my surprise, I saw Babaji emerging from behind some trees. Before I could ask myself whom it was the crowd was actually greeting, I found myself in a temple with about 22-foot tall statues guarded by stern Brahmins keeping an eye on those in line. Babaji climbed up a tree to watch us. 3 people in front of me worshipped the idols, left money, and went their way, At this point, I was ashamed to get out of the line and insult them. There was no way to leave discreetly, so I went forward and worshipped the idols, although inwardly I prayed to Christ. Thus did I transgress the commandment I had heard so clearly when I ascended the steps of Babaji's ashram. I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. Without realizing it, I had spent the entire day participating in the Hindu worship of idols by following a ritual sacrifice made as an offering to them. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't think about the Christian martyrs who lost their possessions, their loved ones, and their very lives in the midst of terrible tortures by idolaters. In order to avoid casting a mere handful of incense into a fire in honor of their idols. If I had thought about this at the time, if I hadn't been under the influence of the charas I smoked, if I hadn't allowed myself to be swayed by my warm feelings for the Dutch former hippie, if I hadn't let the demands of etiquette trick me into getting into the line, perhaps I would not have ended up doing what I never intended to do. I feel you, man. I really feel you, bro. I really feel you. I really understand. The next section is called Demon Possession. But I'm running out of time, so I will pick it up on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you, and good night. Wow. All right. I'm going going to put on The Coal Miner's Daughter. Okay, a book by Michael Witcoff on the Masons and their lies. We're on chapter 6. And on the Masons and their lies, what every Christian should know.
In order to continue his assault on Christianity by way of distortion and perversion, Pike also quotes from History of Freemasonry in Europe by Emanuel Riebold. As usual, his intention is to convince the naive reader that Christianity is nothing but recycled paganism. He begins by commenting on the form of the ancient Christian religion, writing that, quote, "In the early days of Christianity, there was an initiation like those of the pagans. Persons were admitted on special conditions only. To arrive at a complete knowledge of the doctrine, they had to pass 3 degrees of instruction. The initiates were consequently divided into 3 classes. The first, auditors, the second, catechumens, and the third, the faithful. The auditors were a sort of novices who were prepared by certain ceremonies and certain instruction to receive the dogmas of Christianity. A portion of these dogmas was made known to the catechumens, who, after particular purifications, received baptism or the initiation of the theogenesis, divine generation. But in the grand mysteries of that religion, the incarnation, nativity, passion, and resurrection of Christ, none were initiated but the faithful. These doctrines and the celebration of the holy sacraments, particularly the Eucharist, were kept with profound secrecy." End quote. Now, it's accurate to say that the Orthodox Christian Church conceals its mysteries from the uninitiated. St. Cyril of Jerusalem wrote in his Catechesis that, quote, "The splendor of glory is for those who are early enlightened. Obscurity and darkness are the portion of the unbelievers and ignorant." Just so, the Church discovers its mysteries to those who have advanced beyond the class of catechumens. We employ obscure terms with others. End quote. Orthodoxy has never denied that it reserves certain doctrines and sacraments for only those initiated into the Church via baptism, as commanded by Christ himself in Matthew 7:6 when he said, "Do not give what is holy to dogs or throw your pearls before swine." But it is false that the story of the passion and resurrection of Christ were not taught to the masses. St. Paul wrote to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 2:1 and 2, "When I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I decided to know nothing when I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." This was the primary message preached by the apostles, that Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, had died for our sins and been resurrected to save us from death. This is the gospel which we are called to preach to every nation and tribe on the planet. And furthermore, what Pike and his brethren fail to understand, assuming they're not deliberately lying in the first place, is that Christianity has long explained the similarities between its forms and those of the pagan religions which came before it. These similarities are not a novel concept, nor are they proof of any sort of equality between the two sets of beliefs. Indeed, there can be no denying that these parallels exist. The early church recognized it, wrote about it, and made clear statements which both respected what the ancient mystery schools got correct and rejected what they did not. St. Justin Martyr in the first half of the 2nd century was just such a man. Having converted from paganism to Orthodox Christianity as an educated adult, he always maintained his respect for philosophy while recognizing that it was only truly fulfilled in Christ. He described pagan philosophy as a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, noting that all truth, wherever it may be found, is indeed from God. Now this brings up the obvious question. If the forms and sacraments of the Orthodox Church were prefigured by those of the ancient pagan philosophical schools, how can we explain such a phenomenon? To that end, I offer 2 possibilities. The true answer may be one, the other, or some combination of the 2. Firstly, I find it reasonable to suggest that just as the Old Covenant prepared the Jews for the coming incarnation of Jesus Christ, the Gentiles were also being prepared for his coming through certain aspects of their own religions. For just as the early Jewish converts saw in Christ their awaited Messiah and the pure Lamb of God, perhaps the ancient Gentile converts saw in him their own awaited Redeemer who came to conquer death. This could explain why the 3 Magi were looking for Christ in the first place. After all, the Zoroastrians were seeking a Messiah they called the Paisios. Having been taught where and when to seek him by the tenets of their own pagan faith, they were eventually led to Christ. It's clear clear from the historical record that many of the pagan mystery schools taught monotheism, the immortality of the soul, divine reward for virtue, and the improvement of the human character. I find it safe to say that Christ has fulfilled all of these previous systems, making them as obsolete for the Gentiles as the Old Covenant has become for the Jews. Therefore, to involve oneself in such matters today is to seek that which has already come. It's to move backwards through time, ever searching for he who arrived more than 2,000 years ago. The other possibility regarding the similarities of the Christian and pagan systems is that, knowing ahead of time what form the church would ultimately take, the demons took it upon themselves to mimic what was foretold by the prophets, and this seems to be the view promoted by St. Justin. By doing so, the demons could simply point to the religions they had founded and say, "We already have that. No need for another school teaching monotheism and immortality." Perhaps by this method they sought to maintain members amongst their own ranks who may otherwise have converted to Christianity. As I mentioned, I don't know whether the truth is one, both, or some combination of these possibilities. All I know is that the forms and teachings of the pagan mystery schools have nothing to offer a man who seeks Christ in his fullness. To demonstrate to you the lengths that demons have gone to in their efforts to persuade men away from the truth, let us continue our examination of the religion of Masonry. Pike once said that Masonry is identical to the ancient mysteries, so let us look at precisely what he meant. If you will recall from our previous discussion of Satan's 4 favorite tactics to use within the halls of Freemasonry, salvation without Christ plays a major role in his strategy. As such, it is only reasonable that the demonic religions which he instituted would outwardly preach good behavior and moral virtue. Not only do such men tend to have better reputations from which to espouse satanic philosophy to the world, but the seductive nature of believing that we are saved by good deeds is a powerful trap indeed. Therefore, I'd like to draw your attention to Pike's commentary on the 26th degree, Prince of Mercy or Scottish Trinitarian. In that section, Pike includes a Masonic catechism in the form of a question and answer session between 2 officers of the lodge. That catechism contains the following exchange. Question: what are the symbols of the purification necessary to make us perfect Masons? Answer: libation with pure water or baptism, because to cleanse the body is emblematical of purifying the soul, and because it conduces to the bodily health, and virtue is the health of the soul, as sin and vice are its malady and sickness. Unction or anointing with oil, because thereby we are set apart and dedicated to the service and priesthood of the beautiful, the true, and the good, and robes of white, emblems of candor, purity, and truth. Question: what is the chief symbol of man's ultimate redemption and regeneration? Answer: the fraternal supper, of bread which nourishes and of wine which refreshes and exhilarates, symbolical of the time to come, when all mankind shall be one great harmonious brotherhood, and teaching us these great lessons, that as matter changes ever, but no single atom is annihilated, it is not rational to suppose that the far nobler soul does not continue to exist beyond the grave. And thus, in the bread we eat and in the wine we drink tonight, may enter into and form part of us the identical particles of matter that once formed parts of the material bodies called Moses, Confucius, Plato, Socrates, or Jesus of Nazareth. Now, this type of satanic Eucharist also takes place during the 14th degree, grand, elect, perfect, and sublime Mason. Rather than being deified through the body and blood of Jesus Christ, the Masonic candidate is simply becoming one with the more noble souls of the past. It mocks the real presence of Christ in the true Eucharist, in which Orthodox Christianity has believed since the Last Supper, lowering such an act to being merely symbolical of a future age. Given that the Orthodox life largely revolves around the holy gifts and the reception of the body and blood of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist, it is easy to see that Freemasonry is little more than a perverted shadow of the institution which it seeks to imitate. Worse yet, the ancient mystery teachings are often precisely the magical arts which God condemns from Genesis to Revelation. In his commentary on the 23rd degree, Chief of the Tabernacle, Pike quotes from Jean-Marie Regon's Masonic Orthodoxy that, quote, among the sciences taught by Hermes, there were secrets which he communicated to the initiates only upon condition that they should bind themselves by a terrible oath, never to divulge them except to those who after long trial should be found worthy to succeed them. The kings even prohibited the revelation of them on pain of death. This secret was styled the sacerdotal art, and included alchemy, astrology, magism, the science of spirits, etc. He gave them the key to the hieroglyphics of all the secret sciences, which were regarded as sacred and kept concealed in the most secret places of the temple." End quote. These occult concepts, ideas which permeate all of Freemasonry unbeknownst to most of its members, are exactly those which the books of Enoch describe as being taught to man by fallen angels. In fact, it was the very teaching of these things to man which are given as a reason for the fallen angels' condemnation in the first place. Therefore, you can see that even in the ancient world, the holy was mixed with the unholy, the divine was mixed with the demonic, in order to draw men away from the very truth which these organizations outwardly claimed to teach. It is not for man to study alchemy and magic. It is rather our duty and our goal to turn from such unfruitful teachings and submit to the will of our God instead. These temptations have always existed, and we must decide whether to imitate the acquiescence of Eve or the obedience of Mary. Without explicitly stating it, the underlying frame of the Masonic mysteries is that there is no meaningful difference between the mysteries of any given culture or time, that none is better or worse than any other, that religious indifference is the only reasonable position to take. It brings Christ back down to the level of what came before him. It negates his work and his sacrifice. It chips away at the mind of the faithful, implying that all schools of knowledge are somehow equal. And yet, in truth, there is nothing to be offered by the pagan mysteries in the modern Christian world. There is nothing they prefigured which has not been fulfilled, nothing they once pointed to which has not been completed, and nothing they can do for man which Christ himself cannot. They are the crumbled pillars of an obsolete building, distant shadows of the fullness of Christ, and serve no purpose in the modern world but to distract from the one and only true path to salvation. Even what may have once been holy in them has been completely overshadowed by participation in genuine Orthodox Christianity. For as St. John of Kronstadt so accurately pointed out, quote, "If one were to put all of the world's most precious things on one side of a scale, and the divine liturgy on the other, the scale would tip completely in favor of the liturgy." End quote. Therefore, do not be fooled by those who conflate truth with lies. Drink no mixture of water and oil, but rather allow nothing impure to approach your lips. Drink only from Christ, the everlasting fountain, and be content to disdain all else. Having become one of us, Christ rendered the pagan mysteries unfruitful and worthless. They have nothing whatsoever to add to his teachings. For Christ gave us mysteries as well, but of an entirely different nature. As the Orthodox chant in the Resurrectional Theotokion, "The mystery which was hidden from everlasting and was unknown of the angels, O Theotokos, was revealed through thee to those who dwell upon the earth, in that God, having become incarnate, in unconfused union, of his own good will accepted the cross for our sake, whereby he raised again the first created, and hath saved our souls from death." St. Paul describes our mysteries in Colossians 1:26 as the mystery that has been kept hidden for ages and generations, but is now disclosed to the Lord's people. To them God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. The true Christian mystery, contained within and revealed by the rites of the Orthodox Church, was not like that of the pagans. The great Christian mystery, the Mega Mysterion, was not known to the angels, to the demons, to the wise, or to the initiated adepts. It was hidden from all creation until the incarnation of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Therefore, any Masonic claims as to the equivalency of the pagan and Christian mysteries are transparently false and absurd. It is simply gibberish to suggest that the apostles would secretly be teaching the exact things they were writing against, and any man with a shred of sense knows it. Lastly, let us examine the physical orientation of Masonic lodges, as this is also an important piece of the puzzle. Where possible, they are situated east by west, with the chair of the worshipful master, the administrative head of the lodge, in the east. The front of each room, or the door through which all new candidates enter a Masonic lodge for the very first time, is flanked on each side by a pillar. These pillars, which are explained differently depending on the degree which a man is receiving, are described in the Blue Lodge as Jachin and Boaz, the biblical names of the pillars in front of King Solomon's temple. During each of his 3 Blue Lodge degrees, the candidate will stand between these pillars and receive a brief speech about a particular aspect of the fraternity which he is joining. Later on, should he continue to the Scottish Rite, it is revealed in the 4th degree that these pillars actually represent occult Kabbalistic concepts, specifically the principles of mercy and severity. As we learn in the Holy Scriptures, the shape and form of King Solomon's temple was based on the tabernacle in the wilderness. Describing the temple and its high priests, St. Paul wrote in Hebrews 8:5 that they serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. This is likewise how Orthodox churches are built, as a representation of the temple and the tabernacle, themselves a representation of where the angels serve in heaven. Orthodox priests serving at the altar are carrying out the same functions with a similar role and presentation as the high priests in King Solomon's temple. Masonry has stolen the shape of these divine forms, mimicking what is holy and perverting it for occult purposes. As you now understand, Masonry is a religion unto itself. It contains mysteries, initiations, language, and even sacraments which ape those of the Orthodox Church, while neglecting the name of Christ and spiritually leading in the exact opposite direction. It is a vestigial remnant of ancient pagan cultures, and is utterly irrelevant for modern man's spiritual progress. It seems, therefore, that in giving Freemasonry to the world, Satan has designed the perfect trap. It draws the honest and well-meaning like moths to a flame, and just like when the moths finally arrive at their destination, there is nothing but destruction in store for its members. To prove to you that this is the case, let us dive a bit deeper into the mysteries of both Orthodoxy and Freemasonry in order to answer the fundamental question which underpins this entire book. What are people seeking, and what is being offered? Pike once described Masonry as a struggle towards the light, but as St. Jerome so accurately noted, the heretics, quote, mean one thing in their heart, they promise another with their lips. They speak with piety and conceal impiety. They speak Christ and hide the Antichrist, for they know that they will never succeed with their seduction if they disclose the Antichrist. They present light only to conceal darkness. Through light, they lead to darkness. End quote. As you will understand by the time you're done listening to the next chapter, Light and the Lost Word, that phrase has a very different meaning for Masons than it does for Christians. And as you get ready for the next chapter, keep in mind what St. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 11:14, that Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. Light and the Lost Word.
I'll leave it at that. And we'll go over to chapter 7 some other time. God willing. God willing. All right. God bless. God bless you guys.